All right. That's a very nice start.
Mixing basics with me, alright? Let's do the introduction, because introductions are important. Little disclaimer, I'm only me, okay? Mo Falk is only Mo Falk. That's logical, right? But obviously I don't know everything, right? I don't have the answers to everything, and I do make mistakes as well. I do have that bachelor thingy, right? That bachelor thingy that you get when you do like a degree in something, and I have that thingy in music production. So I do know what I'm talking about, but I may still be wrong about some things, alright? So now that we have that out of the way, let's go. Mixing context. I bet a lot of you haven't even thought about this yet. Acoustic situation basically means, how are you set up acoustically? Do you have your speakers set up properly? Like, do you need to have an equilateral triangle? Is that how you say it? Like, all angles have to be the same, like 60 degrees. And it also depends how far you're seated away from your speakers, what room you're in, how your acoustic treatment is working, all sorts of stuff. Everything matters. And that's one thing that you need to just have in mind while mixing, okay? You don't need to necessarily change your mixing habits, but you just need to be aware of it and think about consequences that might have. For example, standing waves in your room or stuff like that, okay? Next thing is ears, right? If they're trained, very good. If they're untrained, also good. You just need to be aware, right? Because there's different kinds of mixing, as you can see here, right? Visual and auditory mixing. If you have very, very good ears, because you may have them because you've been mixing for like 50 years and you're super pro, you can probably rely on your ears. But then again, if you're not that good at mixing, you don't have that much experience with your ears, right? You can't hear every single frequency. You might have to rely more on like your eyes, looking at certain analyzers, looking at EQ curves, you know, doing whatever. Then there's the whole point of referencing, right? Like, what are you referencing? You know, what's the kind of music you've been listening to lately? How do they mix? You know, stuff like that. Then you have a psychological state, which is actually more important than you may think, because psychological and emotional states actually really impact the way your ears work, and every organ works actually in the body, as far as I'm concerned, at least I think. So if you are in a good, you know, emotional state, you're probably fine to mix very well. But if you're having a tough day, rough, you know, whatever, you're not feeling too well, you maybe mentally drowned or something, maybe don't mix, because, you know, you're probably not going to get the very, very best results. Then we have volume, okay? What volume are you mixing at? That's also very important. There's a lot of discussions whether or not you should have it at low or loud volumes. I definitely say somewhere in between. And what I do, I sometimes switch from very loud to very quiet. And then, you know, I try to keep it quiet if I can, just, you know, for my ears. But then again, sometimes you need to go loud just to feel it, because actually your frequency response that your ears have depend on the volume that you're listening to. So if you're listening to louder volumes, you will hear more bass. You won't hear more bass, you will perceive more bass. So there's a lot of like weird things in there. And also, you know, I put experience here because depending on how much experience you have mixing, you will approach mixing a track differently. Obviously, right? Obviously. But having that in mind, I think is going to go a long way. You know, first of all, with you not being too pretentious about stuff or like just trying stuff out when you're like not 100%, you know, into it. All right. So next one is a few thought processes that are important. Start simple, okay? You have a track, let's say it's completely unmixed. You're not gonna go in and tweak 2000 hertz on that one little hi-hat that appears twice in the track. No, you're gonna do like a broad, rough mix, right? That's how you start. You do big changes first that are easy to do, that are logical, and then you refine. Right, you go to the smaller details, you go to the smaller details, you go to the smaller details. Very important that you don't go all in at first and you do the small details. You got to build it like a house. That's why I have house building example here. It's important that when you build a house, right, you don't start with the roof if you don't have any walls. Clearly, right? So you start with what's important. It's a fundament, like the foundation of the house. Then you can put walls up, then you can put a roof, then you put windows in, and then the last thing is like painting the walls and putting furniture in, right? If you don't have a roof, why would you put the furniture in? That's what I want to explain with that, okay? Start broad and narrow it down to smaller problems until these problems are so small that you no longer hear them. Obviously, there's some reason to this. That's why I have within reason in there, and it's actually misspelled. If you hear something, don't feel constrained to not do anything else, right? Like, you're like, oh no, I need to tweak the bass first because it's more important than that little hi-hat. If it's just a little tweak, just tweak it, you know? Like, don't break your flow and be like, constantly have it on your mind. I can't forget to do that hi-hat later. Just do it quickly and then go back to the important things, right? But the general idea is start broad, narrow it down. Now we're coming to an important distinction in mixing fundamentals. There is a single, element mixing and there's contextual mixing. Those are not actually called that way. I have literally just named them like this so that you can understand what I mean. There's no specific name for it. It's just important that you understand. Single mixing is basically things that you do on a per track basis, okay? So for every sound, for every element, for every instrument, you just do that, right? You gain stage, you EQ, and you check the dynamics. You make sure it sounds good. Logically, right? For every sound you have, it's got to be in the right volume. It's got to have the right EQ. It's got to have, compression or whatever you want on it. So dynamics. Contextual mixing is more of like an entire track thing, right? So once you've done all the basic things for every individual sound, you're going to start looking at the overall track or the overall balance of your track, right? Is my break loud enough compared to my drop? Are my drums in the drop different from my drums in the break? And then you will do single mixing to actually fix all of that. Then I have experience here, which kind of plays into contextual mixing where, for example, your kick, you'll always have it at the same level. Like, my kick's gotta hit 0 dB, otherwise it doesn't sound thick, right? So that's kind of like a rough guidance that you can use as well if you want to find your entire balance of the track. But usually it's very difficult. And here's also the debate coming in with, do you mix while you already have a master on? Or do you mix and after put the master on, right? There is arguments for both sides. All right, my take, I have my master on while I mix, so that then when I'm done with the mix, right, and I didn't have a master on, think about it, and then I add a master, my entire mix is gonna sound different again because I have multiband compression on the master and like limiting and like EQ and stuff. So if I have my mix done, I wanna know what it's gonna sound like in the very end, right? So I have my master on, but it's different for everybody. Some people like to do a clean mix and then enjoy the difference from a clean mix to a clean master, on like a one-time thing. But it depends. Like, there's personal preference, and I know people that do it each way. So let's get into the fundamentals, right? Let's start talking about gain staging. Gain staging is where you make sure that the sound that you have is at the right volume all the way through your chain. Your audio chain. So you start off by, the emitter of your sound. Either that can be a microphone input, it can be a sample, it can be the first thing that actually emits the sound, right? Then you go through your mixer. Which effect does it go through? Which, what's the output level at? And all of those levels, right, should, right here, have a little bit of headroom. And the easy way to say it is you want to avoid it being clipping. Like, you don't want this to clip. You don't want any audio to clip. That's why we gain stage. Gain staging doesn't mean leveling, okay? It doesn't mean getting it to a right level. It just means your audio won't break at any part, or lose quality or degrade at any point in your signal chain. EQing. Here's EQing. It's very nice. We all love EQing. Ears versus eyes debate. Do you mix by looking at the EQ and deciding where your frequency problems are, or do you listen to it? Depends on personal preference. I personally like to do more visual mixing than auditory mixing, and I try to combine them, right? Combining is probably the way to go. But if you've mixed for a long period of time, you should probably start relying more on your eyes because they don't get tired as much as your ears do, right? Other way around, if you've just started, you can probably still rely more on your ears and, your eyes as well. But that's how I go about it. Like, if I know I've been mixing for 3 hours, I don't trust my ears anymore. Just, Then we have your plugin preference. Just make sure that you have a plugin that you know inside out. It doesn't matter which plugin it is, as long as it can do what you need it to do. I would recommend use a plugin that actually works, okay? That works for you and that inside out, so that you don't lose any time, because you're gonna be EQing a lot, and a plugin that does that quickly for you is every time you use an EQ is gonna save you like 2 or 3 seconds. Multiply that by 50 and then multiply it by 100 again for every single track that you use it on and every project you use it in, you're probably going to save a few days in your life. All right. Next thing is EQ shapes. And for that, again, we're going to switch over to FL Studio. There is a bunch of EQ shapes that are important, and I'm going to show you this with ProQ, and there's different applications for it. Little, like small adjustments, right? You can do with a bell shape, which is just this. It just does like, has a fall off, tweaks a little bit of frequencies. That's it, right? Then you have low cuts and high cuts, right? Which are clearly, you know what they're for. High cut is to cut highs, low cut is to cut lows. And they go down to infinity theoretically, depending on which offset you have. If you have it like at a very high dB per octave rate, it goes down very quickly. If you have it very low, it's a very shallow decrease. There's a few more, which I personally use, which is shelves. Shelves are very, very nice if you want to tweak everything above a certain frequency, right? Make sure you use these. Let's say all of my high ends are annoying, but all of my bottom end is fine, right? So I could just use this. Instead, right, compared to doing it with a bell curve, you would have to do something like that. Right? That's annoying. That's not cool. No, you don't want to do that. You want to use the appropriate shapes, and it's very quick, and you should learn it, and it's like, there's no reason not to use it, okay? Easy stuff. First, for now, it's easy. Start broad when mixing, right? Let's say you have a sound and you're like, something's off in the low end. Don't make a shape like this, like a super narrow EQ, and just like take that out, that one frequency. No. Start broad, especially while mixing. You want to fix the big problems first. So you just do like a broad EQ, you're probably good to go. And then later on in your mix, you're like, it's still not perfect. You can go in and actually put more effort and more detail into your EQ. You know, maybe put some like small resonances out, stuff like that. I would always recommend start big and then narrow it down as you go through your mix. Okay, in terms of like just size and scale of your changes that you're making. Next one is obviously mid-side stuff, right? So there is mid and a side signal for all of your tracks, right? Because we're in stereo, there's mono and stereo, and it's split. And you can also affect them independently with your EQ. Do it, because a lot of the times, a lot of stuff that really happens in your mix isn't necessarily stereo and mono problems. Like, you will have your leads and your chord stereo, your vocal mono, whatever, or bass, and then, you know, the problem will only be there on a certain sound because it's conflicting with whatever is there already. So you may not have to take it out across the entire width of your track. You may just have to take it out either in the stereo or in the mid, okay? Just something to think about. I do that a lot. Then we have dynamic EQing. Very, very handy if you're too lazy to actually like automate your EQ points and stuff like that. You can set a threshold and tell the EQ, hey, if anything goes above this sound, EQ exactly this frequency. And it works. Use it. Then we have the whole low cut debate on should you low cut everything, right? Let's say you have a lead sound. Don't low cut it unless you have to, okay? Low cutting has two problems. One of them is here, as I said, analog versus digital, right? So there is a problem with an analog EQ that it increases your phase distortion and it messes up your phases. It's very difficult to get a clean submix if you have low cuts in there, especially on your bass. So I would definitely don't recommend that. But obviously, if you have some rumble in there, right? Take it out. Make sure that if you have a lead sound or anything that has a nice fundamental sound, that the low cut point you set starts under or like lower than the lowest time your fundamental frequency is playing, right? So the fundamental of a sound is the lowest frequency of that sound, which is usually the characteristic for the key it's playing. And all the harmonics of it, which are the frequencies above, are representative of the character and the timbre of the sound, right? So low cuts, make sure you have them where they're supposed to be. Let's talk about some jargon. This is for the real beginners, but you know, it's fine. Mud, air, nasalness, and sibilance and all of that things that people usually say. Like, I don't know if you've gotten that, but if you get feedback on the tracks, like, yeah, it's too muddy. What does it actually mean? Muddiness is around 130 to 300 hertz, which is like where your tracks start sounding very like dull. like it loses all of the definition in like the low mids and high lows. That's where mud is. So if somebody says, hey, your mix is too muddy, he means you have too much stuff going on there, or there's a frequency in that spectrum of frequencies that is clashing with something else, okay? Then there's airiness that we talk about, which is everything above, I would say 7,000 or 6,000 hertz. Above here, that's where your airiness comes in. It's like the very high frequencies. Baby crying frequency. This is the thing that I use most in all of my tracks when I EQ. Humans, okay, this is important. Humans have evolved to hear when their babies are crying. Obviously, right? Because the humans that hear their baby cry are more likely to have babies than the ones that can't hear them. Logically, right? So our species, the ones that are around now, are very, very, very sensitive to frequencies from 1000 to 3000 hertz. It's that way, we hear it almost double as loud than anything else because we are naturally responsive to that frequency, because that's the frequency where babies cry in, okay? Those are like the frequencies, 2000, 1000 to 3000, somewhere there is where babies cry. So you need to make sure that that frequency is held in check. There's no name for it, just from now on, it's gonna be the baby crying frequency, okay? Dynamics. Dynamics are basically compression. That's what we mean to say with dynamics. It means how dynamic is your signal. Whatever signal we're talking about, if we're talking about the entire track, if we're talking about a single sound, dynamics is the difference between the highest and the lowest point of your signals, right? If there's a lot of difference between the high sounds and low sounds in terms of volume, we talk about a high dynamic range. If there's very little difference, if everything is always at the same volume, there's very low dynamic range. Okay? So far, so good. Let's talk about compression. I don't want to get into the actual details like I did with the EQ for dynamics, because there's a lot to talk about and that probably deserves its own masterclass. But I'll talk a bit about what exists so you can try it out, and then like just a few problems that you may have with transient and pumping, how to fix them easily. So yeah, let's start with normal compression. Normal compressor takes your sound, looks at how loud it is, and then performs whatever you tell it to do depending on the volume of your sound, okay? So usually it's like, hey, compressor, my sound is sometimes like this, sometimes like that volume, right? I want it to always be one volume. Can you make the lower sounds louder and the higher sounds lower? And your compressor will be like, sure, let's do it, right? I don't know why I did that so stupidly, but that's basically the idea. With the compressor, you can take the peaks of your sound down and the low notes up. Low notes, like low levels of your signal. Used for all sorts of stuff, almost anything. I'm using it right now on my microphone to sound more, you know, uniform, if that makes sense. Parallel compression is the next thing, where you basically don't compress the entire signal, but you split your signal up into two signals. On one of them, you put a big compressor with a lot of way too much of a compressor, right? It's like way too heavy. And then on the other, you don't put a compressor. And then afterwards, you put them back together. So it's parallel. You get some compression and then you get some nothing. And you put them both back together. Sounds very nice on drums. I never use it. Not that cool. Multiband compression is the thing that you should always be using. This is gonna be your time saver when mixing, okay? Trust me when I say this, put it on absolutely everything. All right. Multiband compression is basically a compressor, but every frequency band now gets its own compressor, right? If we look at this logically, right, and we look at this dynamics thing here, you can see we have a compressor here, we have a compressor for this frequency range from 140 to 2000, we have a different compressor for 2000 to 10,000, and then one for the 10,000 and above. And all of these behave independently of each other. So anything that's happening in the bass doesn't actually affect anything that's happening in the mids, doesn't affect anything that's happening in the high end, doesn't affect anything that's in the very top end. They all work independently. What happens is, usually with a compressor, the problem is, if you have any big loud bass sounds, for example, everything else will start ducking when the bass goes up, right? Your high end is gonna duck because your bass is all of a sudden loud. You don't want that. That's why you have a multiband compressor, because it handles the bass when the bass is loud, and it handles the high end when the high end is loud. All right, use it. Solves all your problems. There's a few problems that you may have. For example, that you get too much transient, like too much click on your sound. Usually, if you have a long attack right? Like let's say 50 milliseconds, 60 milliseconds. The compressor will take a bit to react. So it will let a little bit of the loud sound through until it reacts, right? So you always get a big click at the beginning of every sound. So make sure that you reduce your attack time. Pumping is same thing, but kind of related to decay of like decay parameter on your compressor. So if you get a lot of pumping, just decrease your decay. That's it. That's all I wanted to say about that. You know, little tips. All right, then we have mix balance. And that is, again, what I was talking about. We're not talking about single elements anymore. Now we're talking about mix balance, like balancing the entire track. We start off by gain staging, and then after gain staging, actually setting all the volumes. So you don't want to have your kick be super loud and your bass be super quiet, right? So you just make sure that they are in a good relationship with each other, but it's all relative. There's not like 6 dB bass, 4 dB kick. It depends on the bass and the kick, and they should work together. You need to use your ears, and you need to use your eyes, and you need to work out what the volume should be, because it's always relative to each other. There's no like fixed level. Once you've set all the levels and the volumes, make sure then you do the EQing. Especially when using samples, maybe from Splice or something, you need to make sure that the EQ balance of all of your sounds is kind of similar. Like let's say you take a hi-hat from that one Splice pack and you take the vocal from some other Splice pack. The hi-hat has like almost no high frequencies and the vocal only has high frequencies. It will sound like they're disconnected. So you make sure that your entire mix, your entire track has similar EQs. Make sure that your hi-hat doesn't have too much highs. Make sure that your claps fits your kicks. Make sure that your bass sound matches your chords. All of that, but in terms of EQing. Think about it. Not only volumes, also EQs. And then once you've done that, you do this exact same thing, but for dynamics. Okay? You make sure that you don't have too much dynamic range in your track. Overall, right? Because you're balancing the entire track. You're balancing, is my mix loud enough in the break? Is my mix loud enough in the drop? Do they match each other? Or does it sound like the break is disconnected from the drop? For example, also you can look at individual sounds. Some of them may be super compressed because they're from Splice. Some of them may not be because they're your own or something like that. You gotta just make sure that everything has similar dynamics and is just overall balanced. And then, once you've done all of that, you'll be like, oh, this is sounding pretty good. Well, let me tell you, you're not even half done, because now you got to do stereo mixing. You'll be like, oh, wow, what is stereo mixing? Yeah, it has to do with your stereo width of your track. It has to do with how far away, how far out are your sounds? How wide does it sound? How far, how deep, how you know, width. All right, stereo mix, there we go. There is a few things that you can do with your stereo mix. Okay, and you do the stereo mixing after you've done what we've talked about until now. Okay, it's important that you don't do the stereo mix first, because it won't make any sense. It's like building the roof before you have any walls. Okay, cool. Don't use panning. We're making EDM. Don't use panning. Nobody uses panning unless maybe for a little bit of an ARP. Don't use it. Panning versus width. Okay, panning means, is it left or is it right? The width of your stereo, of your track or whatever, means, is it like mono or is it stereo, right? It means not left, right. It means, you know, you get it, right? It's logical. There's a few panning no-goes, right? Never pan your sub basses, never pan your kicks. Don't widen them. Just let them be, okay? Let them have their piece. Thanks. When we talk about stereo widening, you need to match, right? Again, with that whole balance thing, you need to match all of your sounds. You can't have your bass all of a sudden be super wide where your vocal is still super thin, and then you have your hi-hats which are panned, or, you know, it's all got to match. So talking about stereo widening, there's two ways, like two algorithms basically, to increase the perception of width. First of them is doing it with delay. So if you delay the left and the right speaker, right, or headphones or whatever, your brain interprets it as being wider. Don't ask me why, it is what it is, okay? That's how it works. So that is one. And there's another, which is to do with phasing. So if there's a phase offset with how the sounds are played, I can't exactly tell you how that works, but basically your brain also interprets it as being wider, right? And there's limitations to both things. For example, if you want to make a kick wide or something that has a clear transient, you don't want to use delay, because otherwise it's very easy for your brain to pick up that it's like ba-bum, and you get two transients because one is left, one is right, and there's a delay between the two. You would use a phase, but with the phasing algorithm, there's only so much you can do because it can't make it fully left-right. It can only go like so far. So you may have to cheat the system a little bit by doing a little bit of both. Usually that's what I do. On the master, for example, you don't want to use delay, you want to use a phase widening. The two ways I make stuff wider is either using a stereo shaper in FL. This creates actual delay between left and right signal. The other way would be with an imager. If you don't set it to stereo-rise, it actually just does the phase thing, right? And that way you don't get multiple transients, you don't get the delay between left and right signal. It just somehow magically, algorithmically changes the phase so that your brain thinks it's wider. Very nice stuff. Thank you, Isotope. There's one important distinction though from, stereo layering and stereo mixing, because stereo layering is something that we will talk about later or tomorrow or some other day, but not right now. But that is a production technique. It has nothing to do with mixing necessarily. Whereas your stereo mixing has to do with mixing because it's mixing. Nice. Now there's also not just the stereo, but there's also the distance, okay? And the perceived distance, how far away certain sounds feel. So, next slide. Distance. Basically, mixing distance, mixing depth is sometimes what people call it, has to do with how far you think whatever's making the sound is away from you. If you're using headphones, everything is literally like 1 centimeter away from your ear. So it's never really going to be wide away or like far away. You're just going to perceive it as if it were, right? A few ways to do that, or like one way to do that is actually if you're very close to a mic, right? You get more low end in the mic. There's a lot of bass now. There's like less highs and everything's very, very like low ended. And if you go very far away, right, you can tell there's way less of that bass, like of that low mid sound in my voice, because the microphone is picking it up differently. All right, I hope that was easy to show. And you can do that with any sound. If you increase those like low mids frequencies, like the muddiness almost of a sound, it will feel like it is much closer to you than if it doesn't have that. Also, there's clearly reverb and delay, which for your brain also mean, oh look, there's now a room and it's very far away, so it has a lot of reverb. But my general philosophy is if you can do something without adding reverb to it, try doing it without, try doing without delay, and then maybe you can actually add that, right? Mixing experience and ground truth. Ground truth means something that is always right. That, let me tell you, doesn't exist in mixing. Okay? As far as I can tell, I have yet to find a ground truth in mixing. Nothing is the correct way to do anything. Okay? There's always differences in everything, and your track there might be super well, and then you do the exact same thing to another track and it's super weird. So you always have to adapt. It's basically starting from zero every single time. If you check the Spotify Top 100, you will hear that all of the sounds, all of the tracks, while they do all sound good, don't actually have the exact same mix, right? Like overall mix balance, EQ, like frequency distribution, dynamics, they're all very, very different because people have different tastes. But they all still sound good, right? So there's one right way that everybody's mixing and mastering their stuff. It's more like preference, and there's multiple ways to get to a good mix in the end. There is a big thing as well where on YouTube or anywhere else, people will tell you stuff. This is how you do your mixing thing. They are probably not true. They're probably not right, okay? Make sure that when you learn stuff about mixing, you can always get ideas from other people, which is what we're doing right here. I'm trying to give you the right ideas to actually mix, but I'm not trying to tell you exactly what to do because, frankly, I don't know, right? It depends on what you're mixing anyways. And if you're mixing your own tracks and it's always the same thing that you're doing and you can tell it's doing the right thing and it sounds better at the end and people are saying, hey, this sounds very good, this is something that you will have learned for yourself, right? Like, hey, when I mix my tracks and I put a low cut at 30 hertz, people like it more. People think it sounds better. Probably for your type of mix, it works, right? But that might not work for everybody else. So just be careful. Mixing also, learning and getting good at a mix and making good mixes takes forever. You will never be 100% satisfied with your mixes, okay? I am not, and I don't think there's many people that are satisfied. And if they are probably lying to themselves and you. Training ears is very important as well. So there's a couple of ways to do that. I would recommend like a frequency guessing game where you get white noise, one frequency gets boosted, you try to recognize which frequency it is, you put it in, and then you get told, oh, it's right, it's wrong. That's very important as well, because it will just make you very fast, make you much better at mixing, and it will get you to realize what mixing flaws you have in your production or even your mix much, much faster, other than having to rely on your eyes so much, or actually having to go into the EQ, setting a bell, muting everything else, and then dragging it along until you find the right frequency. Ideally, what you want to be is like, boom, oh, all right, that was 450 hertz, something like that, right? Like just immediately when you hear something, be like, okay, that was that frequency that I hear. Oh, the resonance is at like 180,000 hertz, something like that, right? Instead of, oh, let me just try to find that frequency. Make sense? There's now some more Falk wisdom. More Falk wisdom about mixing. The most important thing. Take freaking breaks. I don't know what, there's some people who are like, oh yeah, I just mixed for 8 hours. Are you crazy? Are you crazy? Take breaks. It's very important. Every half an hour, take 2 minutes break. Turn your sound off, look at your phone, browse Instagram for 30 seconds, go back to mixing. Every hour, take a 5-minute or 10-minute break. It's not gonna harm you, it's gonna do you good. Those 10 minutes you will have recouped in 2 minutes once you're back, because your brain will have had time to process everything, get new perspective. Very, very important, okay? And in those breaks, don't think about music. Think about anything else. Put a game on, put a TV show on. I don't care. Take breaks. Next wisdom is, I've learned this thing, yeah? Don't tell anybody, but reverb on sub sounds bad. You need to learn the rules, right? That's why we're doing this. You need to learn the basics of mixing. You need to learn why people mix the way they mix. You need to understand what's happening so that then you know how to break those rules. Okay, it's very important that you're not this kind of type of person who's like, oh, but my teacher told me to do a low cut at 800 hertz and now it sounds bad. What am I supposed to do? No. Even if the rule were to put a low cut at 800 hertz, if it doesn't sound good in your case, learn not to do it, okay? Learn to break the rules. Come on. This is the Wild West of mixing. You can do anything you want. All right, to wrap it up, I think we're wrapping it up with this, right? Let me see. Yes, we are wrapping it up with this. Take all mixing advice with a grain of salt. Even this one. Anything I've said, anything anybody ever says about mixing. Think about it critically. Think about, okay, some of this applies to me maybe, some of this is stupid. It's important that you don't believe anything you hear, okay? Not from me, not from anybody. Make up your own minds, and in the end, you'll be much smarter for it. Don't be smooth brain. All right, and now, Masterclass is over. That's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. Bye.